So please, finally, your Q&A with Mr. R. Burton and the audience. So if you have questions, raise your hand.
Mutia?
Mr. Reeves, my question is directed somewhat into your research. Like yourself, I have some roots in Oklahoma, and I was wondering a little bit more about where I can find things about what was going on during the days before statehood. My great-grandfather settled in a place called Boley, Oklahoma, and I've been doing some not really structured genealogy, and I'd like to look more into what and where I can find those types of information.
Okay. There's a lot of people in Chicago actually are descendants of Indian freedmen. And there's a lady named Angela Walton Raji, R-A-J-I. She's in Baltimore, but she's a Choctaw freedman, and she's the best in the nation in terms of African Indian genealogy. She has several websites, Angela Walton Raji, and you can just put a name in. I'm sure a lot's going to jump up on the computer. But they also have Bruce Fisher at the Oklahoma Historical Society, or the Oklahoma History Museum in Oklahoma, and he can be able to help anybody with information they may need and point them in the right direction of where they can do some research. There are some genealogical organizations in Oklahoma. Being that I work mainly with Western history, I haven't worked too much in the genealogical area, but there's a lot of information I know of Boley. Boley was the largest black town in Oklahoma, and Oklahoma had 30 black towns. So there's quite a bit of available information on Boley that you can find.
Thank you very much.
You are.
Come forward, stand. As a matter of fact, we're going to do this table topic style. Come on over so that way we can get you on camera. Come forward here. Tell me your name. Parker. Mr. Parker, we're going to do this table topic style, and in table topics we have 60 seconds to say what we have to say. So in 60 seconds, ask your question, and then Mr. Burton, in 60 seconds, give your response. You guys got it?
Got it.
All right, Mr. Parker, go for it.
My question was regards to the Oklahoma area as well as out west. You had made a point the fact that blacks were at times slaves of the certain Indian tribes. Was it not true at the time of every treaty that the United States had with the Indians? Part of that treaty was the fact that they were supposed to return runaway slaves at that particular time. And if I'm not mistaken, that's part of every treaty that the United States made with the Indians. Unfortunately, they did not always return the slaves. They incorporated them into their own lifestyle.
Well, yeah, the relationship between Africans and Indians are very, very, and depending on where you're talking about in the country. Now, where Native Americans in the South, where African slavery was predominant, you did have the Catawbas, that's in South Carolina. They were paid to bring back African slaves, and I believe Cherokees were also involved in catching African slaves if they were runaways. But some tribes gave refuge to African slaves if they were runaways. It was across the board in terms of what happened between Africans and Indians. And actually, during the Indian removal, the Trail of Tears, some Native Americans didn't want to leave the South, so they stayed in the black community and passed as Africans.
Was that also true of the Seminole Indians in regard to the fact that the black slaves would run and escape to Florida in regard to the Seminole Indians?
Yeah, no, the Seminoles are completely different, and that's a whole nother discussion, but there was no Seminole tribe until the American government made the Seminole tribe. And so what you found is that a lot of the Africans who were runaways went to Florida, where a lot of the Native Americans who were fighting the U.S. government had established themselves. And this word Seminole is a corruption of the word Cimarrone, which is a word meant maroon. Maroon was a term that the English used for runaway slaves. So the root of the word Seminole reverts to actually runaway slaves. And so what actually, the blacks had their community, the Indians had theirs, and the blacks and Indians formed an alliance. When they were pushed to Indian territory, the Seminoles said that the Africans were their slaves to protect them from being bought and sold and put back into slavery. And the Indian tribes, Indian territory, used to hate this because basically black Seminoles were free.
My next question is in regards to the fact of, say, that the person you're doing research on. Did you distinguish him as a deputy marshal or as a bounty hunter? And the reason I asked that question is because there were at least 3 outstanding black bounty hunters during those periods of time, along with deputy marshal. And did you find any research on that as you were writing your book?
Yeah, the bounty hunters are Hollywood inventions. There was no bounty hunters like you see in Hollywood. Basically, if a person was a bounty hunter, there was a deputy U.S. marshal, there was a sheriff, they were authorized by the territorial marshal to bring people in for bounty. There was no independent bounty hunters like, you see in Hollywood or they have today, where these people are doing this from an individual standpoint. Generally, bounty hunters were law enforcement that were trying to do something to increase their salaries or to make a little extra money. So Bass Reeves was a bounty hunter, and he got great bounty on some of the criminals he brought in. But Hollywood, the whole thing, wanted dead or alive, a lot of that's garbage. There's no such thing as a bounty hunter like Hollywood pushes it forward.
Wow. Well, Mr. Parker, everyone give Mr. Parker a round of applause for the 3 questions that he asked Mr. Burton. And before we close out the Q&A segment, I just wanted to make sure if there was anyone else that had a question for Mr. Burton while we have him here in the hog seat. All right, I see 2. Let's get, I saw Angel Swan first, and then give me your
My
first.
wife got a question back there.
And Debbie, and then, are you putting her on the spot?
Right.
Come forward, Angel.
Hi, Mr. Burton. My question is about Mr. Reeves' family life. Did he have a family, and were they descendants?
That's an excellent question. We have not been able to find direct descendants of Bass Reeves. We have found his great nephews and nieces, but not anybody directly related to him. And it seems kind of strange because he had 11 children. And he did have a few that died before he died. But after he passed, he had at least 4 or 5 children still living. And we've been trying to locate direct descendants, but at this point we haven't been able to do that.
Wow.
Hopefully we will.
Thank Angel Swan for her question. Come on up, Debbie.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. It was mentioned that Indian Territory was one of the most dangerous territories to be a marshal. What made this area more dangerous than others?
Well, basically, Indian Territory was a federal protectorate, and so the federal government had general jurisdiction. The Indians had their own courts, their own police, but they couldn't arrest black men or white men who were not citizens of their courts. There was no extradition treaty between the Indian Territory and any of the surrounding states, Kansas, Missouri, Arkansas, Texas. So you could come to Indian Territory, and there was no large towns per se. Most of the towns were very small. And there was a lot of places to hide out. So Indians, a lot of times you had white people primarily came in and squatted illegally in the Indian Territory. And sometimes they were rooted out, sometimes they weren't. During the whole history of the U.S. Marshal Service, which is the oldest in the United States, oldest federal police, they have a little bit over 200 been killed in the line of duty. 120 were killed in the Oklahoma Indian Territory. It was very dangerous. Then you had Indian policemen being killed, local police being killed. It was the true battleground of law and crime during the late 19th century. It was really bad. And so it was a lot of deputies really lost their lives. And I think that was part of the reason they decided to put the U.S. Marshals Museum in Fort Smith, Arkansas, which was originally the federal court for the Indian Territory. That court had the largest jurisdiction in the United States, had 75,000 square miles. So it had part of western Arkansas and all of what is today Oklahoma. And they used to execute people. Judge Parker, they would execute 4 and 5 at a time sometimes. And he said he didn't really believe in executing people, but he said that was the only, determination he had to carry out that law, was to execute criminals. And if you look at the criminals who were executed, I think 30 were white, 29 were Indian, and 28 was black. And so it was fairly even across the board in terms of black. And then the gangs a lot of times were not all Indian or all black, they were integrated. Many times the gangs had whites, Indians, and blacks in it, and then the law enforcement had whites, blacks, and Indians in the posses. And so it was fairly integrated. And it was probably the most integrated place in the United States in the late 19th century. Yeah, for law enforcement, especially. There also was a lot of blacks in the Indian police. I found blacks in the Creek Nation Indian Police, Choctaw Indian Police, Seminole Indian Police. And so a lot of that, those people though were Indian freedmen. So they were citizens of those Indian nations. But many of those black law enforcement officers became pretty famous themselves at that time.
Well, Debbie, everyone, thank Debbie for her question because we got some more history from that. Thank you, Debbie, for asking that question. And Mr. Burton, thank you so much for being available for the Q&A. We're now ready to turn it back over to our Toastmaster who will introduce us to our band, our music.